Excellencies, distinguished delegates, from the great threat of nuclear annihilation. Mr. President of the Conference.
It's not clear. The treaty took some pretty heavy hits earlier on. The North Koreans withdrew from the treaty when they were in violation, and we didn't do anything. Let's not have any nonsense. They have nuclear weapons. We're free citizens here. So it's quite clear they have them. How many nations are in the treaty? Almost all of the world's nations. The exceptions were pretty much the ones that you listed that matter. The question is not so much, well, is it broken, but do you want to strengthen it? The treaty will not work unless we see them, as well as the superpowers in the United States, rely less on nuclear weapons.
For more than half a century, the world has relied on one central framework to prevent nuclear weapons from spreading, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. But today, the system is under exceptional strain. There are no longer binding limits on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. Global powers are modernizing instead of disarming, and tensions around Iran's nuclear program continue to escalate. All of this comes as diplomats prepare to gather in New York for the NPT review conference taking place from April 27 to May 22, 2026. The question now is no longer whether the system is being tested, but whether it can still hold. And that is the questions I'm going to ask my guest, Henry Sokolski, Executive Director of Nonproliferation Policy Education Center and former U.S. Deputy for Nonproliferation Policy at the Pentagon. So, hi, Henry.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. So we're heading into the NPT review conference at a moment of real crisis after years of failed outcome and no agreement. Is the NPT still functioning or it's going through motion?
It's not clear. The treaty took some pretty heavy hits earlier on when the United States accepted a weapon state, India, not into the NPT, but gave it all the benefits as if it was in the NPT. It didn't help that a little bit earlier, by about, 10 or so years, the North Koreans withdrew from the treaty when they were in violation, and we didn't do anything. We only sanctioned them after they exploded a bomb 3 years later. I could keep going, but it's taken a number of hits. And the question is, are we going to do what we need to do to strengthen it? Or are we going to just let it list to port and gracefully sink into the sea?
You already mentioned how this played out with North Korea. It withdrew from the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 2003, freed itself from international inspections, and went on to test its first nuclear weapon. Just a few years later, in 2006, today, it continues to expand its nuclear capabilities. And now Iran is considering a similar path. So does that mean the core bargaining of the NPT has effectively collapsed and that leaving the treaty is becoming the most viable route to acquiring nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that's a little rough. After all, how many nations are in the treaty? Almost all of the world's nations. Almost all. The exceptions were pretty much the ones that you listed that matter. That's not many. Not only that, but in the end, they have to decide whether they're safer with their weapons or not. And, one of the things that the treaty holds out is the demand that countries that are in the treaty, the 5 that have nuclear weapons, that's the UK, France, Russia, China, and the US, should be bargaining in good faith to control and limit their reliance on nuclear weapons. That is a complaint because right now, the Chinese clearly are building up, and certainly every other nation is modernizing at the very least, even if the quantitative number hasn't gone up. So that's a problem. But the question is not so much, well, is it broken, but do you want to strengthen it and, if you will, fix it? There are other more fundamental problems, which I think you alluded to when you said, well, does the treaty allow countries to get right to the brink of bomb making and go over the brink and then not penalize them? I think the short answer is, if you interpret it the way it's been interpreted, I think an argument could be made that you're right. It doesn't have to be interpreted that way. And I think this is perhaps one of those moments where at least people on the outside ought to be clear-headed about what's required. And you'd hope some governments would speak up about how we need to reinterpret the way the treaty is applied.
This takes me to the core of the treaty. So Article 4, I believe, gives countries the right to a peaceful nuclear energy. So where does that right start and ends? And where does the proliferation begin?
Well, I think you're asking a really excellent question. We've dodged the bullet on that. And when I say we, it's not just the United States. It's a lot of developing countries, China and Russia. The standard answer roughly has been for many decades, well, if you say it's peaceful, if it has some conceivable civilian application, and it's under some kind of routine inspection from either a multilateral group like Euratom or more likely the International Atomic Energy Agency, we're good to go. I think we've learned that that's not enough. Certainly it wasn't enough in the case of Iraq. It wasn't enough in the case of Iran. It wasn't enough in the case of North Korea. All of those countries were members of the NPT. All of those countries had their facilities under IAEA safeguards. All of those countries got very close or went over the brink of getting bombs. So you would think that that would be dispositive for the need to reinterpret what exactly is peaceful. Now, in this regard, the Iranians claim or insist that they have a right to make nuclear fuel, in this case, enriched uranium, or they don't say it as much, but to strip out plutonium from spent reactor fuel or reprocess it and chemically get that plutonium, which you can make bombs out of. They argue that the right to peaceful nuclear energy and the prevailing interpretation of that provision in the treaty, it gets them absolutely a hall pass to do what they're doing. However, if you read, which is not something people are inclined to do, but if you do read the negotiating history, and I haven't done all of it, but I did most of it. It's 10 years of manuscripts to read. You discover that, in fact, there were efforts to say not just peaceful nuclear energy, but that countries that don't have bombs should have access to the entire or the full fuel cycle, which is code for making nuclear fuel. Well, guess what? They put it to a vote. They rejected that idea. That suggests that there's a problem. And if you look further, there are speeches explaining why that vote went that way. As was pointed out by the British and the Swedish representatives and several other developing nations representatives, once you make nuclear fuel, you're so close to making a bomb in time that by the time you could detect there was a diversion, you wouldn't have enough time to intervene to prevent the bomb from being built.
How much time we are talking about?
Well, days or weeks. And that being the case, the idea that you could safeguard it, which is defined in the treaty as something that prevents military diversions, may not be possible. Now, is it the case that something that can't be safeguarded is peaceful? Logic would suggest an interpretation here, plus the negotiating history would suggest we need to draw the line more carefully because we've experienced being mugged by too liberal an interpretation.
I do really want to go back to the inspection system, but I also want to follow up on the timing of how long it actually takes to build a bomb. After the 2025 war on Iran, and now with a ceasefire in place, there are reports that Iran has enriched uranium to 60% or more. So based on that timeline, would that already be enough time for Iran to have reached a nuclear weapon capability? Or are we still talking about a different stage entirely?
Well, we don't know. I mean, one of the problems and the reason we call these proliferation threats instead of just military threats is it's very hard to know where everything might be or what, stage of development you might be once they've already made nuclear fuel, once they've already done experiments to strip out the spent fuel, and they have. Well, where might these small units that are needed to convert the gas into oxides and the oxides into metal and the metal being machined into an insertable core be? And in the case of reprocessing, where might that small reprocessing activity go on? It could even be done in glove boxes. We know they have that. So the point here is there are a lot of unknowns. Now, some people say, well, we've bombed an awful lot. Chances are they're years away. Others say, well, we don't know. They might be weeks away. Good luck. This is not simply an intelligence problem. This is baked in the cake.
Since the 2005 strikes, the International Atomic Energy Agency has had limited or no access to some of Iran's nuclear facilities, and in some cases has lost visibility over key materials and sites. So technically, we did not stop Iran's program, but rather stall it, while allowing it to continue in a less visible and potential more advanced way. What do you think?
Well, I guess, we're trying to, what is it? The Israelis use this ridiculous, I'm sorry, I can't buy into it. Mowing the lawn is what they're referring to. I don't mow my lawn with bombs, but apparently this is the analogy or metaphor. Good luck. I mean, you're trying now to destroy knowledge. They say, oh, we've got the top scientists. Well, you may not need top scientists anymore since they have the design and they know how the processes work. You may not need super talented people anymore to complete this. Or certainly not as much as you did before when you didn't crack those codes. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. I think it's okay to do worst case analysis, even though I suspect, the worst case analysis is off. And the reason why is you should have demands on the Iranians that would make you comfortable with the uncertainties of where they might be. That would require some pretty tough love. And I don't see it yet. I don't see it on two fronts. One, I don't see it with regard to us making very clear that, we never said, the United States and other countries, that they ever had the right. And we keep saying, well, we never said they had the right. But what we haven't done is say they don't have the right. And if we say they don't, we need to generalize that to other similar cases. You can't just pick on Iran and make it stick. Otherwise, you're just pushing them around militarily.
Israel is widely believed to possess nuclear weapons, despite never officially confirming it, and remaining outside the Treaty on Non-Proliferation Nuclear Weapons under a long-standing policy of nuclear ambiguity. So, if we take a step back and play the devil's advocate, does this suggest that the global non-proliferation system is really about rules or about who countries are politically and how they are treated?
I think you've picked on a very obvious point. And by the way, let's not have any nonsense. We're not officials.
No.
They have nuclear weapons. It isn't that they are alleged to have them. They have them. And we can say that. Maybe government officials can't say that, but we can. We're free. We're free citizens here. So it's quite clear they have them. And I think reasonably enough, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the North Koreans, have to be given a pathway to get out from underneath having them. In the end, the treaty will not work unless we see them, as well as the superpowers in the United States, rely less on nuclear weapons and their threatened use for our security. That actually is not crazy. That makes some sense. What's interesting is this administration deserves credit for taking Article 6 more seriously than people did before, saying, well, the Chinese need to join us in coming up with restraints that point in a direction where we rely less on these things. Okay, now it could be, everyone's cynical and says, well, you're just doing that to, make the Chinese look bad. It's okay. I don't care what the motives are. Work on it. I think it is a serious point. I don't know that it's the centerpiece of a treaty that has the word non-proliferation in it. It doesn't say the disarmament treaty, but it is a support for keeping nations from thinking they need to get them themselves when they don't have.
So the question really is, why would any country would trust the system or choose to follow it if the rules does not apply on everybody equally?
Well, it's a problem, and that's the reason why I think it's time to come clean on who has what and why they should belly up to the bar of talking about controlling, reducing them and going in the right direction instead of up. So that's point one. But I think there's another reason. The economics of the things that make for nuclear weapons, which tend to be peaceful initially, are not terribly positive. If you want to make electricity and you want to spend a lot of money, go nuclear. It is the electrical power source of governments. It is not what the private sector would normally do. I mean, we're seeing a lot of private sector interest in the United States because of the enormous subsidies that the government will give if you want to build one. Without those, it might be so unattractive, even the very wealthy people that want to use this for data farms would be frightened off. So the one thing you've got going for you is God's invisible hand, as Adam Smith would say. The second thing is, it's not easy when you war game the use of nuclear weapons to know how the story ends. And it scares people more often than not when they game these things. That's true of people who live in countries that are superpowers, like the United States. I suspect it's also true, believe it or not, even for Mr. Putin and his crowd, because if they were going to use nuclear weapons, you would think they would have done it by now. It's been 4 years they've been threatening. For some reason, they've chosen not to use them. So there are real reasons for arguing that the treaty appeals to something that actually makes sense, and you want to make it make more sense instead of less. So the contradictions, in the treaty, the way it's interpreted, that some folks are outside of it, yeah, you want to address that. I think that's absolutely right.
I want to come back to the inspection issue, but from a different angle this time. For the first time in over 50 years, there are no binding limits on U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenal following the expiration of the New START. The treaty didn't just limit weapons, it created transparency through on-site inspections and continuous data sharing, and now those mechanisms are gone. You've also emphasized both in the Wall Street Journal article and our conversation last time how critical inspections are to maintaining stability. Let me ask you this. So how dangerous is this moment? Are we now operating in a true blind spot where major powers are making decisions without real visibility into each other's capabilities?
Well, let's try to double down a bit on that general term, inspections. In the case of the superpowers, you do want to have verification procedures, not just visits or inspections, but things that, reliably verify what the numbers are and whether people are staying within limits. Part of the problem with some of these agreements is that they were getting a little ragged on that front, particularly in an environment where no longer is it just Russia you got to worry about, but China, who is a country that has refused any kind of serious limits. They say, well, you can trust us. We're not going to use them. We don't have many, but we want to tell you what they are, the numbers. Well, come on. They're becoming they are a superpower effectively now. They need to start behaving like one. So I think the Biden administration and the Trump administration's plea that they need to come to the table, and I give Trump's administration actually more credit because they pushed first, but Biden actually repeated it. He didn't scream it, but he repeated it in his address to the review conference last time around. They're totally correct. And I think other nations, should feel comfortable saying, well, America and these other countries are right, in demanding this. I think you got to focus then on coming up with verification procedures to make sure the numbers are what they are and they stay that way. With regard to peaceful nuclear energy, it's trickier. You're not counting things. You're trying to make sure things don't emerge that need counting. So what you're trying to do is make sure that activities and materials aren't diverted to make bombs. And you need to be able to get reliable signals early enough that you can intervene to prevent any attempted effort to divert from turning into a bomb. That is not just inspections. That is a safeguard. And safeguards are much tougher criteria to meet than just inspections. Much of what passes for a safeguard may not be much more than monitoring, and we need to make a distinction.
Can you please break this down for us? Are we effectively blind today when it comes to Iran nuclear activities? And what does that actually mean in practical terms for how close they could be to a weapon?
Well, part of the problem when you have what's called bulk handling facilities, there's a nice technical term. Well, what's that? When you make fuel, you're dealing with liquids, powders, and gas. Now, keeping track of molecules, essentially, of things that, float in the air or run through your fingers is not going to be the same as accounting for multiple ton fuel assemblies that are solid. Therefore, you have to start asking yourself, is this safeguardable? I don't think it is. It's been argued for many decades that it isn't. The agency wanting to please all countries, the United States wanting to please its allies and friends, has said, oh, well, you can, or it's not as big a deal. And it is a big deal. And we've seen this in the case of Iran. You can abruptly tell the inspectors to leave, and then you're off and running. And the amount of time it can take between when you tell them to leave and what you need to make a bomb could be quite short. Or you could cheat very, discreetly, such that folks wouldn't know that you're siphoning off a little bit every day, but pretty soon you have several bombs worth. That's when you're making nuclear fuel. I think it's easier, and I think quite possible and totally credible to safeguard big solid objects, number one, as long as they are not the actual nuclear fuel that's needed to be inserted into a weapon itself. Once you get separated plutonium or highly enriched uranium, it's too late. Those things cannot be safeguarded. So those materials and the fuel making activities, I would say, should not be called peaceful, and they should not be seen as something countries have a right to play with. Then the problem is this: we've grandfathered or allowed countries under the treaty to do this. Japan is a good example. Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, they all make nuclear fuel. Well, that's pretty bad. But maybe you should stop making it worse by saying, oh, well, other countries, therefore, should be allowed. I think you've got a problem there. I'm not sure how to deal with it, but I would certainly stop digging a hole. And that's what we're doing, and say, oh, well, we have to make our mistakes hereditary and keep doing this. I think we got to stop.
Let me step back and read the signals as an observer. Russia and China are increasingly positioning themselves as defenders of nuclear rights. Whether out of principle or geopolitical advantage, while the United States is calling for arms control and transparency, even as it continues to invest heavily in modernizing its own nuclear arsenal. At the same time, China says it will not join arms control talks unless the US and Russia reduce their arsenal first. So, are we moving towards a rule-based nuclear order or a power-based one?
Good question. Don't know. I do think you've put your finger on the hypocrisy, which is China wants to build up. It isn't just that it's waiting for us to come down. I mean, it likes saying that, but it knows we probably won't, particularly when they're building up. I think when you negotiate in good faith, you don't try to prejudice the conditions. It doesn't say, well, you'll negotiate in good faith when you have a situation where you can prevail in negotiations. And that's sort of what they're more or less saying. And people are slow of foot allowing them to get away with that. I think the beauty of them coming to the table would be that it would be extremely hypocritical at that point for the powers to then say, oh, we're still building up, we're still doing this and that. We'd have to say, okay, while we're negotiating, we need to modulate our enthusiasm for building up, certainly quantitatively. So I don't know, how the story ends is unclear. A lot of people say, oh, well, look at Putin, look at, our president, look at President Xi. There's just no way these folks are going to relent. Well, there is something that is very democratic in this world. It's called death. And what happens is people die and other leaders come in. And some of these people are pretty old. So things can change, and they do. We saw this in the 50s when Stalin died. We lack imagination if we don't think long term. If we think short term, everything is tragic. Long term, there could be better endings. I think we have to be committed to the long term in this, because on these things, even the most successful arms control agreements, and there are some, even the Trump administration in the first term identified, ironically, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty as at least as successful when it made sense. I mean, it's stated, and then, they were right to, I think, get out of it. But the fact of the matter is, at the time, it made a lot of sense. That took 10 years to negotiate. Well, why should it take less time now? We need to keep our eyes on the long-term prize. Not only that, but the kinds of things we should be negotiating should be different now. In the 1930s, we were controlling for battleships and cruisers. These are big ships. In 1950, 20 years later, nobody even cared about battleships. They were worried about aircraft carriers. Well, some of these treaties we're talking about are about that old. So you might want to be controlling for other things than what we have been controlling for. All of that's a separate topic, and we can talk about it later. But in other words, I don't think losing an old treaty is dispositive about what the prospects are of gaining a sounder set of restraints later. May not be ripe and in season immediately, but these things don't drop off the tree immediately anyway. We need to get focused on what is possible long term.
While the NPT Review Conference just around the corner, taking place in New York from April 27th to May 22nd, expectations are already being shaped by growing divisions and recent events. For countries watching from the outside, especially the Gulf, the questions are becoming more strategic. Israel remains outside the treaty and is widely believed to possess nuclear weapons, while Iran, as a member, has faced pressure, inspections, and military strikes. So looking at the long term, what do you expect from this conference? And how are emerging or undecided countries likely to read this moment? Do they see value in joining the system, or are they more likely to question it given these realities?
Well, no, you're raising good questions. Look, Some things you can count on because almost every review conference has something about a weapons-free zone in the Middle East, which raises the question of Israel's, nuclear possession that it denies it wants to talk about. So you can count on, I'm just going to tell you the usual things. The United States will make noise about China, not agreeing to good faith negotiations. The Russians and the Chinese will complain about the United States threatening to forward deploy weapons, either having them in Europe 100, whereas I think the Russians have forward deployed an order of magnitude and maybe a factor of one or two more. But we can't talk about that because they don't admit what the numbers are. No. The Chinese will not want to talk about their building up, but they will want to talk about us supplying nuclear submarines and offering to do so to Australia and possibly forward deploying weapons per the requests of people, let's say in South Korea, maybe Japan. So those things you can count on. I think what you won't hear necessarily, but should hear if folks were more serious about this treaty, is what ought to be considered to be peaceful. We've gone through that. Also, can countries withdraw when they're in violation with impunity, or should there be automatic sanctions that weren't in place in 2003 when North Korea withdrew? Now, this has been discussed in 2005. Maybe it's time to take the idea of automatic sanctions for any country that's in violation of its NPT obligations to the IAEA to open up for inspections, which would be Iran, if they withdraw, and tell them what those country neutral sanctions will be at a minimum, so that you might deter them from withdrawing until they come back into compliance. That's something we ought to talk about. We ought to talk about the clear prohibition in Article 2 to help countries manufacture or try to manufacture the non-nuclear parts of the weapon, the implosion devices. There's no enforcement mechanism or organization. Do you want to create one? We ought to talk about that. Seems to me that's pretty important because countries play around in that area, and there's no agency, not the IAEA or the UN Security Council, that has the charter to do anything about that. So those things come to mind right away. And, clearly, as I say, this right to what it is that peaceful nuclear energy is really needs to be roughed up. Would you get agreement on these things? No. Would you be able to join the issue? Yes. Would that be useful? Yes. Why? There are other forums, like the Convention on Disarmament, which I believe holds meetings in the summer. Mm-hmm. There's the IAEA General Conference in September. There are other places to pick up where you lay down the marker. But if you don't lay down the marker, you'll never get these issues joined in a more serious fashion. And it takes time to get people to understand where we need to go.
Let's hope they will lay down the marker in this review this year. Thank you very much, Henry, for your time and for all this information.
Thank you.